Ethics Untangled is made by the Idea Centre at the University of Leeds. It's a podcast about the difficult ethical questions we face in everyday life. In each episode, I interview someone, usually a philosopher, who's spent time thinking through one of these questions. And we try between us to work out what's going on. Firstly, a quick content warning. This podcast contains some fairly frank discussions of sex and sex work. While there are many different kinds of sex work, by far the most common scenario involves a man paying a woman for sex. It is, in other words, a highly gendered activity. The question of why this is one of those questions that might seem obvious, but on closer inspection turns out to be not obvious at all. It turns out, in fact, that there are multiple possible explanations, some of which fit better with the evidence than others. Natasha McKeever, a lecturer in applied ethics at the Idea Centre, has been examining this evidence and trying to come up with a definitive answer to an explanatory question which also intersects with some ethical questions. For example, would the world be a better place if sex work was less gendered, or if it didn't exist at all? Okay, so I'm here with Natasha McKeever. So Tash, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Jim. Thank you for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here.
Great. And we're here to answer this question, why is sex work so gendered? So I thought, first of all, I wondered if you could just tell me what you mean by sex work in this context.
Thanks, Jim. Yes, I'm using the term sex work to refer to sex work involving payment for sexual services involving direct access to sex. So what's often referred to as prostitution. So not pornography or stripping, etc., which are also part of the sex industry. And I'm using the term sex work because it's the preferred term of many sex workers rather than prostitution.
Okay, that makes sense. All right, thank you. And the question is, why is sex work so gendered? So what do you mean by saying that sex work is gendered? What does that mean?
So what I mean by that is that the vast majority of sex workers are female. So approximately 80 to 90% are women, and approximately 6% of those are trans women. And so the majority of sex workers are female and the majority of buyers are male. So 11% of men in the UK have paid for sex, compared with less than 0.1% of women. And 4% of men have paid for sex in the last 5 years. Right. So we've got a situation where the majority of people selling sex are of one gender and the majority of people paying for the sex are of the other gender. And where men are sex workers, they typically sell sex to other men rather than to women. Right, okay.
And I think you kind of make the comparison with like other areas of work, right? That where it does seem like, you know, many areas of work are gendered, but not quite in the same way that sex work is gendered.
Yeah, thanks. So there are obviously lots of other professions where you just have predominantly one gender doing them. So, for example, childcare is done overwhelmingly by women, but childcarers provide childcare for both men and women. And equally, building work is done predominantly by men, but again, builders work for men and women. Yeah. So I can't think of another profession where the sellers are primarily from one gender and the buyers are primarily from another.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Okay, why do you think that question's worth asking? Why is that an important question?
Well, sex work is often viewed as being degrading, shameful, dirty. It's also often very dangerous work. So sex workers are at a high risk of being assaulted physically and sexually. They're at a higher risk of being murdered. So you've got a situation where you've got one gender doing this type of work that's widely considered to be degrading, shameful, dangerous for another gender, and that seems just problematic in itself. But also I think that Deborah Satz argues that and I think I agree, that the gender imbalance in sex work has some role in all women having their status lowered merely in the acknowledgement that other women do such work for men, but men don't do such work for women. Right. And I think this probably contributes to the gender imbalance, also probably contributes to the poor treatment of sex workers as well. Right. So I imagine if there was an equal number of men and women selling sex, I suspect that we would conceive of it differently and treat sex workers differently.
Right, yeah, that's really interesting. And is this a question that people have asked before, or are you the first person to kind of engage with this empirical question? Why is sex work gendered?
Yeah, so I'm not the first person to have considered it, but to my knowledge, this is the first kind of paper that's considered it as a whole. I could be wrong on that, but I haven't come across any papers in particular that have looked at this question. And I think that it's quite often just taken for granted that this is the way it is, that this is the way that sex work exists. The sort of common image of a sex worker is of a woman, and the common image of somebody buying sex is of a man. And it's quite rare to sort of question why that might be. It tends to just be thought that that's just how things are.
Yeah, okay. In the paper that you've written about this, you kind of raise various possible explanations for why this might be. So maybe we could kind of go through some of those in turn. So, I mean, the first one is, well, maybe it's men pay for sex more than women do because they want more sex than women do, and it's a way of them getting more sex that they wouldn't be able to get at otherwise. So is that right, do you think?
Yeah, so I think this would probably be one of the first reasons that people might come to if they were thinking about why it is that sex work is so gendered. It is widely believed that men have higher sex drives than women. And there is evidence which supports this view. You know, there are various surveys that show that men want to have sex more frequently and with more partners than women do. And we often look to evolution to give us an explanation for this. So there's a kind of a model called the standard evolutionary model, which says that men have higher sex drives because in the period that humans were evolving, it would have been more reproductively advantageous for men to kind of spread their seed and have sex with numerous women, whereas for women, it would be better for them to find a mate who'd support them and bring them food while they were kind of looking after their children.
So the idea is that, like, for the male of the species, they're going to be able to kind of propagate their genes more effectively if they just, like, you know, impregnate as many women as possible. Yeah. Whereas the woman's going to be more effective by finding one partner who's going to kind of care for them long term, or care for the child long term, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
So I don't think this is a very good explanation for the gender imbalance in sex work. For one, I'm kind of sceptical that it's just true that men have higher sex drives than women. It seems that there are alternative explanations for the kind of evidence that's referred to when people make these claims. You know, there may be social explanations for why men typically want more sex than women. It might be that women are just so overburdened with childcare or emotional labour in their relationships, for example, that they don't have the space to desire sex. It might be that the kind of sex that men and women are having is less enjoyable for women. Mm-hmm. And it might also just be that women underreport and men overreport how much sex that they want because of kind of cultural and social norms around what's desirable for men and women to be like sexually.
Okay.
And there's conflicting evidence as well. So there's also evidence that suggests that women and men have similar levels of sexual desire. And there are issues with the standard evolutionary model as well. So, that's not a kind of unquestioned model for thinking about human evolution. Like there are alternative models and suggestions that it's just kind of based on 1950s sort of ideal of the family.
Right. Okay, so I mean, neither of us are evolutionary biologists, so perhaps we don't want to get into the detail of what the merits of that model or problems with it might be, but it's at least it's not kind of uncontroversial among biologists.
Yeah. Right? Yeah, so I try and avoid getting into it in too much detail in the paper as well, because I don't have expertise in evolutionary biology. But I think that we don't need to get too bogged down into that, because even if we did accept, for the sake of argument, that men desire more sex than women, I don't think that's going to give us a a full explanation for the gender gap in sex work. So that's because men who buy sex typically have more sexual partners overall.
Right.
So the more unpaid sexual partners a man has had in the last 5 years, the more likely he is to have paid for sex.
Okay.
And men who have paid for sex have had on average 31.6 sexual partners compared to 13.6 for men who haven't paid for sex.
Right.
So that it doesn't seem like they're just paying for sex in order, like because they can't find sex elsewhere.
Right. Okay.
And also, even if it was the case that the average man desired more sex than the average woman, you'd still have the non-average woman who would want more sex, who'd want a high number of sexual partners.
Right.
And so presumably, if people were just buying sex because they wanted sex, then you'd see higher numbers of women paying for sex.
Yes. Okay. And the numbers are very low compared to men. Yeah. Okay. All right. So if it's not that, is it that men pay for sex because they want a different type of sex than women do, and it's a type of sex that they're not able to find elsewhere?
Yeah, so this is another suggestion that it could be because men are biologically predisposed perhaps to want sort of casual and emotional sex, or perhaps sex involving domination, whereas women might be biologically predisposed to want kind of emotional, loving sex that they can only find in a relationship. And again, the standard evolutionary model would give us an explanation for this. And again, you can find evidence which supports this kind of view. But again, I feel that I'm kind of skeptical about it. So again, there might be a case that women might underreport their desire for casual sex, men might overreport it. And even if there are differences in the kind of sex men and women want, we don't know if that's because of social norms around sex rather than biological differences.
Right.
And if that was the case, then desire would be more mutable. So we wouldn't expect it to just stay kind of fixed according to gender.
Right,
It would be more changeable depending on cultural norms.
Okay. So there's kind of, I just kind of to dig into that question a bit more. I suppose there's different ways in which we might construe this idea that men want a different kind of sex than women. So like one of the things that you look at is, the idea that men want a kind of sex where they're kind of very much the dominant partner. Maybe they can't find that elsewhere, or, they want, I don't know, kind of particular sexual practices that they're unable to find elsewhere. And the other suggestion is that what they're looking for is more casual sex, right? And that's difficult for them to find, because, hypothetically, women aren't so commonly looking for casual sex, right? So, is that more plausible that it's a way for men to have casual kind of no strings sex in a way that they find difficult to find elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean, it's possible, but another thing to bear in mind is that a large number of men, when they're buying sex, they are looking for the so-called girlfriend experience, which is where a man has sex with a sex worker, and the experience is supposed to kind of mimic what it would be like to have a girlfriend, so more emotional, intimate. And a study from 2012 found that the majority of men who were buying sex online were seeking a girlfriend experience. So not kind of, doesn't seem like they're specifically motivated by casual experiences there. And only 6.4% of the men in that study strongly agreed with the claim, I like to be in control when I'm having sex.
Right, okay. Yeah, that's interesting. I suppose you might think that that girlfriend experience thing might still be a kind of casual sex. I mean, it's not a sort of completely transactional, unemotional kind of sex, but it still might be casual in one respect, which is that there's no strings attached. It's like it is a transaction, and then you can kind of move on. Yeah,
they still get to control the time that they're spent with the woman, I suppose, so they can just up and leave at the end. So there may be something in that. But then again, we would still be left with the non-average woman. So again, even if men were buying sex because they wanted a kind of casual sex or sex involving domination, you'd still expect there to be more women than there currently are paying for sex, because there are women who also want casual sex, and there are women who want sex where they get to dominate somebody.
Right, yeah. And this, I don't know if this is a separate question, but there's a sort of economic way of looking at this, like a kind of supply and demand way of looking at it, whereby let's say that on average, men are more likely to be looking for, short-term commitment-free sexual encounters, and women are less likely to be looking for that. Then there may just be a lot less availability of that on the kind of sexual market for men, and therefore they might be motivated to look elsewhere for it. So does that make sense? Is that an explanation?
Yeah. So you might just say, well, it's just to do with availability. So women can find casual sex more easily than men can, so they don't need to pay for it. But again, I don't think this is going to get us a full explanation, because there are also going to be lots of women who can't sort of find casual sex. It's just not the case that any woman can walk into a bar and pick up a man. Like, they may not have the confidence, contacts, time, skill, and they may not be desirable to men or to other women sexually as well. Again, I think if it was just availability, you'd see more women paying for sex than there currently are.
Okay. Right. Okay. So let's just recap quickly. So we don't think it's because men just want more sex than women do. We don't think it's because men want a different kind of sex that they aren't able to find with women without paying for it. And it's not because men find it more difficult to find available women who are kind of willing to have casual sex with them relative to women. So it's not those explanations. So I think one of the things that you found when researching this paper is that a lot of philosophers have kind of very closely associated sex work with sexism and the patriarchy, and actually kind of argued, or maybe in some cases just assumed, that if we didn't live in a patriarchal society, there just wouldn't be such a thing as sex work. So why do people think that? And do you think that's a plausible view?
So, I mean, I agree with these feminist philosophers who think that sex work is linked to patriarchy. And one of the claims that I make in the paper is that I think sort of patriarchal gender norms explain the gender imbalance in sex work. But some feminist authors kind of take it a bit further and suggest that sex work is kind of brought into existence because of patriarchy.
Right.
So it's a sort of public recognition that that men are sexual masters over women. That's a quote from Carol Pateman. And so I think the idea is that kind of we have sex work because men are in a more powerful position and they feel like they kind of own women's bodies and deserve the right to them. And so therefore we get sex work, and that sex work is kind of necessarily exploitative of women, and that it would just never be the case that we would have it reversed or have a kind of gender equal sex work, because if we got rid of patriarchy, sex work would just go away.
Yeah.
And so I think I agree to an extent. I agree that the patriarchal norms are what gives us sex work in the form that we have it now. But I don't think that they're right that it would go away without under conditions of gender equality.
Okay. Why do you think that is?
So partly it's just that there's quite a diversity of the kinds of people that pay for sex and their motivations, and also in the kind of people that sell sex. And I've found some interesting research into women who pay for sex. So although they're a small cohort, they do exist, and some of their motivations for paying for sex are kind of similar to men's motivations, buying sex for pleasure, for intimacy, to learn. But also many of them say that they have sort of therapeutic motivations as well. And so I just think that, even if we were kind of living in a gender equal utopia, people are still going to want pleasure, intimacy, learning through sex, and sex work is an avenue that could provide that to people.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So maybe I think that question about kind of women who do pay for sex, why do they pay for sex, is really interesting. So maybe just get onto that in a moment. But I think one of the interesting points that you made in the paper that kind of made sense to me was, well, yeah, I mean, so the idea is that because kind of sex is commodified and it's something that men pay women for, that's supposed to imply that it's just kind of, it's inherently bound up with the patriarchy, right? But I think you kind of made the point that just because you pay for something doesn't mean you're necessarily in a position of power over the vendor, right? So like actually in many cases, if I buy something from Amazon, it doesn't mean I've got power over Amazon, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I think that point was made by Ole Martin Moen in a paper about prostitution. But yeah, I think that's right. And also that kind of power exists in different dimensions. So you may get somebody who's buying sex from a sex worker, and perhaps the buyer is a disabled male. So, and the sex worker is an able-bodied female. So she's disadvantaged in terms of gender, but he's disadvantaged in terms of being disabled. So you can get people being disadvantaged and advantaged in different ways.
Right. So it's not as simple as, you've got one powerful party and another powerless party, I suppose. Yeah.
I mean, and I'm sure that is the way things are in a lot of cases, but I don't think we can just make it as a blanket claim that that's how it always is.
So the problem is with the kind of the blanket claim, which is to say that that's just intrinsically what it's all like, and if those unequal conditions didn't exist, the whole thing would just disappear. That's what you find implausible. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So this question about so you did some research, or didn't do research yourself, but kind of looked for research into the relatively few women who do pay for sex, like what are their motivations for paying for sex? And I thought that was kind of interesting because it does sort of tell us a bit about, where those motivations might be. So what did you find in that part of research?
Yeah, so there was a paper looked at by Caldwell and DeWitt from 2021, who are Australian researchers, and they interviewed, I think it was around 20-ish women who'd paid for sex. And an interesting thing is that about half of the women gave therapeutic motivations as their motivation, so including seeking healing from intimate partner violence and child abuse. Right. So that was kind of interesting because, I mean, obviously it's very sad, but also it's still bound up with kind of patriarchy, that they're paying for sex because they've been harmed by men. So that's quite a different sort of motivation to the idea of the man wanting to pay for sex because he's just wants to dominate a woman. These are women who are kind of seeking to pay for sex as a way of healing from being dominated in a way.
I suppose it's not just that they're looking for paid sex in that situation because they've been abused or harmed by men, but it's also because it's a way of them getting access to sex, which wouldn't in itself be harmful, or they wouldn't have reason to kind of fear, right? So they'd feel safer. Yeah,
so some of them said that they feel safer paying for sex from a sex worker than going and picking up a man in a bar. And I suppose the internet helps with that a lot because you can go on websites and read reviews of sex workers, which does seem quite crude, but it helps with people with feeling safe, I suppose, because if they can see, well, other women have been to this guy
Yeah.
and he was sensitive and,
Right.
caring, then they'll feel more confident going to him. So and then the other three motivations were buying to learn, kind of learn about sexual practices or try new sexual practices in a safe context, for intimacy and for pleasure. So I think the last three motivations are quite similar to what you find from male motivations as well, but the therapeutic sort of motivation is you probably find that more from women who pay for sex.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So you don't think that sex work would just disappear if the conditions of the patriarchy were absent, but you do think, as you've said, that patriarchal norms have a really important role in explaining why sex work exists in the way that we do actually find it in society, right? So in what way do you think those patriarchal norms play a role, and which particular norms are you interested in?
Yeah, so I think there are kind of like broader sort of structural norms around money and time that probably play a role. So women have less disposable income than men, and they have less leisure time than men. They also do a lot more unpaid care work than men do, which probably means that they'd find it harder to get time away to go and pay for sex. So I think those are probably factors.
Right.
But also I think probably what's playing maybe a larger role is gendered norms around sex. So women perhaps might worry about the damage to their reputation if it was found out that they had paid for sex. And they may be unaware that it's possible for them to pay for sex, or they may worry that they may have fear for their safety. And I think there are probably two underlying, overarching norms around sex that underlie a lot of this. The first one that I discuss in the paper is that the norm that men should be sexually dominant and women should be sexually submissive. And then the second is that sexual purity is viewed as important for women, but not for men. Okay.
So take the first one of those, the norm that men should be sexually dominant and women should be sexually submissive. So why would that explain why, sex work is gendered in the sense that men are much more likely to pay women for sex than vice versa or other
Yeah, well, I guess men are still often expected to initiate sexual activity and dating activity, whereas women are more often kind of seen as sexual gatekeepers who choose to consent or not to consent to sex, but not to kind of initiate it or have their own desires.
Right.
So as buying sex involves initiating sex and can be seen as an act of dominance, it might be that men are more confident or more comfortable in that sort of role, and that women are more sort of comfortable in the role of providing for male sexual desire, because I suppose that's just the sort of norm that we've grown up with. Right.
Okay. Good. And then the second one is the idea that kind of sexual purity, the norm that sexual purity should be important for women in a way that it's not for men. So what does that mean, and why is that relevant?
Yeah. So I mean, the idea of women being sexually pure, or kind of that they should be sexually pure, has been used throughout history as a way of controlling female sexuality. And there are many examples of really heinous things being done to women in the name of this norm. And things are still, heinous things are still being done to women because of perceived kind of damage to their sexual purity. Right. So in kind of contemporary mainstream Western culture, it's less of a strong norm, but women are still held to different sexual standards to men. They're still widely expected to prefer sex which is loving, emotional, romantic and monogamous. And they're still shamed and punished when they don't have these kind of preferences or they don't accord to the norms. And even in worst cases, they might be seen as fair game for rape and violence for not conforming.
So there's a stigma against women paying for sex because it's perceived to sort of speak to a lack of sexual purity. Is that the idea?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. And I think it probably also influences the way that male and female sex workers are perceived.
Right.
So do you know Mac and Molly Smith, who are two sex workers and activists and authors who've written a really good book, Revolting Prostitutes? They argue that sex work kind of signifies a moral loss for women in a way that it doesn't for men. So men who sell sex are not seen as kind of losing something special in the way that women who sell sex are.
Right.
And, you might think about that in kind of norms around virginity as well.
Yeah.
Like the women or girls losing virginity, it's seen as a much more kind of a bigger event. And
Sure.
like they've lost something special in a way that it's just not really for boys and men.
Yeah, absolutely. So I suppose that point about kind of that stigma affecting women who sell sex as well, I suppose you might then therefore kind of ask, well, if it acts as a motivator against women for paying for sex, it surely ought to act as a motivator against women selling sex as well, and presumably does, right?
Yeah,
why do you
presumably
think
it does. And I guess that means that many women who do sell sex are often doing it because maybe because they're desperate or because they lack other options,
right?
Because it is so stigmatized, and the norm also makes female sex workers much more liable to bad treatment and violence and humiliation. So it means that the women who go into it are probably are more likely to kind of lack other decent options.
Yeah, so there's kind of economic, I suppose, primarily economic factors that are overriding that norm in that case. Yeah. Is that kind of backed up by, because I think there was some evidence in your paper from, maybe more from men who sell sex and their motivations for doing that, which kind of suggests that in many cases, men might be more likely to do it because they enjoy it compared to women, right?
Yeah, so I think, men who sell sex to women at least are less likely to be doing it because they're sort of out of economic need and more as a kind of recreational activity to get a bit of extra cash. Yeah. I don't know if that's the same for men who sell sex to men. I haven't looked at that. But women are more likely to be doing it out of economic need. So, I guess that's an interesting thing to consider about whether there would be more women who would do it out of enjoyment or as more of a recreational activity if there was less stigma attached to it for women.
Yeah. Okay. Great. All right. Thanks very much. So, one of the kind of broader questions that I wanted to ask was, kind of if that's the picture that you're kind of drawing of why sex work exists in the form that it does, what's the ideal here? Like, what should we hope for? I mean, to put it crudely, like, do you think the world would be a better place if there was no such thing as sex work, or if it continued to exist but in a less gendered, more balanced form?
Yeah, so I guess in an ideal world, everybody would have their sexual and emotional needs met, and I don't think it would necessarily be better if that was done in a context where they weren't paying for it. I mean, maybe it would be, because I suppose if they weren't paying for it, they wouldn't have to pay for it, and paying for something takes money away from you. Sure. But yeah, I think our aim should be kind of a world where people do have their needs met in a way that's where everybody's happy and treated respectfully. Yeah. So I think so people who think the gender imbalance in sex work is problematic, like me, often call for its abolition, and they kind of see it as maybe a necessary evil or something that we should try to kind of improve at the moment, but ideally we'd want it to go away. And I think that there is an alternative, which is making it more gender balanced and improving conditions, and looking to make it a more kind of respectful, inclusive, kind profession.
Right. Yeah. 'Cause it seems at least plausible, given the way you've described the effect of these patriarchal norms, right? It seems like those norms that you've identified, the way they make sex work gendered is by inhibiting women from paying for sex, right? Rather than primarily by kind of motivating men to pay for sex more. Does that make sense? So it's kind of, if it's this norm of purity, right? The reason that makes it imbalanced is because it stops women wanting to be perceived as impure by paying for sex. So does that kind of suggest that if you were somehow to remove these patriarchal conditions, what would actually happen is you'd have more sex work, but it would be increased on the women paying men or perhaps paying other women side rather than decreasing the amount of sex being paid for?
I don't know though, because if we had conditions of gender equality, I mean, I don't really know what that means and whether that's actually possible. But you might get fewer men paying for sex and more women. So it might be that the overall amount of sex work that there was would stay the same,
right?
But it would be more gender balanced. Perhaps because of the kind of gender norms that might encourage men to seek to pay for sex, the kind of dominance norm,
right,
or the sort of norms about, or the association between masculinity and having sex with a lot of women,
right,
that might encourage some men to go and pay for sex. So if we got rid of those kind of norms, you might end up with fewer men paying for sex.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It's obviously, these kinds of hypothetical questions are impossible to answer, but it's interesting to sort of speculate, I suppose. So is this part of a bigger project for you? Are you kind of interested in the ethics of sex work more generally? And how does this kind of question about how gendered sex work is fit into your kind of broader philosophical interests?
Yeah, so I think this is going to be part of a bigger project. So when I started writing this paper, it was going to be more of a sort of, what should we do about the gender imbalance, or how do we address it? And I've found that just addressing the first question of why it is imbalanced took me a long time. So and the gender imbalance is also only one issue around sex work that makes it problematic. So I think I would like to do a bigger project looking at kind of what would good look like for sex work, because a lot of sex work that happens is really horrible, and people aren't treated well, and probably nobody leaves very happy. But I think that it would be possible for it to exist in a very different kind of form, and I'm interested in thinking about what that would look like and how we would get there, and whether it's possible.
Great. Maybe when you've done some thinking about that, you'll come back and we can do another episode on what we should do about it. That's great. All right. Well, that's all we've got time for. So, Natasha McKeever, thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, Jim.
If you enjoyed this episode of Ethics Untangled, please like and subscribe and recommend us to your friends. The podcast is edited by Mark Smith at Leeds Media Services, and our music is by Kate Wood. Ethics Untangled is brought to you by the Idea Centre, a specialist unit for teaching, research, training and consultancy in applied ethics at the University of Leeds. We offer master's programmes in healthcare ethics and applied and professional ethics, and PhDs available full or part-time and face-to-face or by online learning. We also offer consultancy and training services for business and the professions, including help with the difficult ethical issues faced by your organisation, commissioned research projects, and online or face-to-face CPD. If you'd like to find out more about these or any of our other activities, please visit our website at ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics.